Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is great to get to be here this afternoon, and of course the two lessons that were excellent this morning. Grateful to have been here for those as well, as I know that you are. I want to say thank you, as Andrew had mentioned earlier, thank you to the elders here, the members, and others who've helped put this together and who've extended great hospitality. The lunch was fantastic. I mean, you can't go wrong with barbecue, so really appreciate putting that together. And it's 1 o'clock-ish, and so we're going to attempt some productive time after lunch. And so I just wanted to, listen, I really do want to dispel any worries about after lunch. So let me just say that if eyelids suddenly start to get a little heavy, if it seems like tuning out is happening, and even if there is maybe just a momentary lapse of consciousness, I really do not want you to be self-conscious about that, okay? If you will just throw something up here and nudge me, I'll wake up and finish the lesson, okay? So I want to begin by doing a little survey, just an informal survey, and you're welcome to participate, as you would like. And but I want to ask about certain books that we're going to speak about here in just a couple of moments. I want to ask how many of us have either heard, and if you'd like to volunteer this, you can, preach lessons from the books that I am about to mention, okay? There are no right answers, there are no wrong answers. I'm just taking an informal survey off the cuff. So how about if you've been in or heard a lesson on the book of Jonah? Would you mind raising your hand? Okay, and I'm accepting that, the one that we just heard from Dwayne right before lunch. Okay, great. And lots, maybe everybody's hand. All right, how about the book of Hosea? Nice and high. All right, how about the book of Micah? Nice and high, okay? How about Zephaniah? Nice and high. Now, just to give a workout on the other side, your other arm, how about the book of Haggai? A few. And what about Obadiah? Okay, good. And quite a number. That's really encouraging to see. But what I will notice is, and you saw this too, there were a lot more hands when it came to Jonah, for example, or Hosea, than there might have been for books like Zephaniah or even Obadiah. And I think that that's probably consistent with most people's experience or observation. There are some books that just don't seem to get the same amount of coverage as others. In the congregations where we minister and we preach, it is not surprising people will say, yes, we've heard sermons from Genesis or from Exodus. We've heard them from the book of Psalms. Maybe, if we talk prophetic literature, Daniel or Isaiah. But if we start asking about the 12 that comprise the minor prophets, probably many members, and it may be that they just missed it when we spoke, but many members might say, I've not heard anything like that, or at least not very commonly. So what I'd like to do in thinking ahead, just to start, is I'd like to think about the relevance of the minor prophets for just a moment, okay? Because if it's relevant, then it'll be something that we give attention to as teachers and preachers. If it's relevant, then that's something that the members of the audience will listen to, right? So the relevance of minor prophets, I'm going to roll just out of line of sight here. As a general observation, the first one that I'm going to make does not connect directly to the minor prophets, but in my opinion, the sentiment behind it is just as applicable. At the turn of the century, so this is dated 2001, January 8th, 2001. It was from the U.S. News and World Report. I realize that is not the most scholarly journal in publication, but on the other hand, as a general observation, it can be very helpful. And this was the description. Life was nasty, brutish, and short 2,000 years ago. But notice that last section. Life then shared many features with life today. And it is true that we drive Chevys, not chariots, right? We wear ties sometimes, but not togas, okay? So there are some real differences. And yet at the same time, there are other areas where there is tremendous overlap. We could simply say these are the issues that pertain to the business of life. Parents want to see their children do well. People like to have stable homes. People like to be able to live in a place where they feel safe and secure. There are those who would like to get ahead in business or other aspects of life. And that is a perennial or perduring concern. It is not something that is just 21st century. Now, if that's true, and I'm convinced that it is, it also means that it's no problem at all rolling that clock back another 4 or 5 or 8 or 9 centuries. It would still be true over the span of centuries that comprise the times of the work of the minor prophets. The point is that they dealt with things that we are often concerned about ourselves as well. And a part of our goal is to make sure that we help surface some of those things. It has been lamented at various points by various persons that the naming of the minor prophets is somewhat unfortunate, because it might be construed in some sense, maybe among members of a congregation who are just not knowing. It's an unintentional misapprehension. But they may think that the minor prophets are less significant. But, as Ed pointed out this morning, even Augustine, right? He pointed out in his work in ministry that in the city of God, they are minor because of brevity. It is not because of their significance or their importance. And so I want to remember that as well. They may be small, but that doesn't mean that they don't have something powerful to say to us. Here's another feature or factoid that I thought was compelling. Did you know that of the 12 books that comprise the minor prophets, 10 of the 12 are explicitly quoted or have strong echoes in the New Testament? Which means that either quoted by Jesus or referenced by him or pertaining to Jesus, like where he's born. Statements that are made in books like Romans or elsewhere, these are figures who looked at the 12 books, at least 10 of the 12, and said, this is something from them that we should point to or we should use. So I think about that as a gospel preacher in our day and time, the Christian age, and I think maybe there are things there that I should find, I should use, and I should share with other people as well. So, what about locating them? And by this, I don't mean necessarily where they live, although that is, of course, important. I want to know where they fit in history. What about time and the circumstances in which they spoke and they wrote? Because I'm convinced that if I understand that better, number one, I'll understand their text better, but I'll also be able to understand and identify those universal principles or ideas that I can highlight for the people that I am also helping their learning and their growth as well. So 4 different chronological periods that I'm going to propose that these dozen fall in. Disclaimer. A number of the books are really difficult to date. I don't deny that. So I also recognize that although I'm going to put something on the screen that I think is reasonable, I acknowledge that good Bible students may look at one or the other and think, well, maybe it belongs here rather than there. So please just take this as a basic suggestion or framework, but it surfaces the real issues, which is I want to understand the time period in which they worked and what it was that they had to say. 4 different periods. The first one, I identified Obadiah, Joel, and Jonah in this late 9th and early 8th century BC. And so I put pre-Assyrian. That does not mean that Assyria is not active, right? But they haven't yet risen to the level of dominance that they're going to in the mid and later 8th century, when they're threatening, for example, the northern kingdom of Israel up to 722. So this is a divided kingdom time period, and here are a few of the items that they focus upon. These 3 books. Others will do similar. They are concerned about idolatry and fidelity to the Lord. They are concerned about other nations. For example, Obadiah is writing to Edom, not specifically, directly to Judah and Jerusalem. You have Joel who writes, and then Jonah, as we had a great study this morning, going off to the nation of Nineveh, right, or to the city of Nineveh and the Assyrian kingdom, right? So they are willing to address other nations. The third thing that I'll mention is that these books and the other ones we're going to mention also deal with social abuses. Even the people of God not treating the people of God like the people of God, or not treating them in a way that is spiritually and ethically upstanding and right. And so they address those in their time period. The next three are during what I've simply called Assyrian dominance, because now really, as far as Israel is concerned especially, Assyria has come onto the scene. So we're looking at the figures of Amos, and then Micah, and Hosea. And if you were to look in the contents, they'll be concerned about the same kinds of things. Idolatry and faithfulness to the Lord. They will address various peoples. And they'll also be concerned with how people are living in God's nations and treating one another, social abuses. Number 3. This is the period that is sometimes referred to as Judah alone, so it's in the 7th century, the 600s. Assyria conquers the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, and so they're gone. They're gone in a way that Judah will not be gone even following their captivity. And so these figures, Nahum, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk, are writing to the nation of Judah. They will point out to the people of Judah that they could have learned from the things that happened to Israel. So they're using others as an example to help direct, cajole, wheedle, anything to convince the people of God to live like the people of God. In this time period, there are some very poor kings, and maybe the majority of them are less than stellar, but you also have figures like Josiah, who begins to reign, at least in his minority, at the age of 8. And as we know in 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23, he is a part of a great revival for the people of God. So there are some good things here, but the overall trend, it's a downward trajectory that will ultimately lead to Babylonian captivity. And our 4th category are the post-exilic prophets. So Haggai and Zechariah, both after the people of Judah and Jerusalem have begun to make their way back under the blessings of Cyrus and then subsequent rulers. And then Malachi, of course, who is the one that is dated the last in the entire Old Testament canon. And in the late 5th century BC, the late 400s. Okay, so it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. I credit, was it Dana that said this? Idolatry is a problem for the people of God in categories 1, 2, and 3. What's interesting is that once they come back from Babylonian exile, idolatry is not a problem for them anymore. They learn their lesson. Now, they obviously have other issues. I'm not, Malachi, they'll point them out. But idolatry is not one of them. They seem to have gotten it. We have the right God. Now they just need to be reminded, okay, then live with that fact directing your steps. So if I can keep these things somewhere in the back of my mind, it helps me, the preacher, appreciate what I'm going to see in each book, but then also what I might observe as a universal truth or principle that I can extrapolate to a modern audience as well. So this helps me bridge the gap between the then and the now. All right. So what are some challenges that you and I might face in trying to relate this material to other people? Okay. The first is just a general lack of familiarity. Okay. And it's not just among church members, although it'll be present there, but it might be among those of us who preach and teach. I know more about the book of Acts than I do the book of Zephaniah, let's say, right? I know that Joel connects to Acts chapter 2, but I may not know a lot more about what Joel contains. And if that's true for those of us who are teaching and preaching, it'll be the case in the pews. And so I need to make sure that I'm prepared to help overcome that. Number 2, they are removed from contemporary context. Okay. There is a certain vocabulary, perhaps. There are certain cultural mores that were present that need to be taken into account, things that Dwayne mentioned in his discussion of Jonah, for example. And so I need to make sure that I help bridge that for them. The next is that these can be really difficult to understand. And good Bible students and expositors look at these books, and certain things are clear, and certain other ones I think, right? Or maybe could be this or that. The fact that we've got a bounded set, as my mathematician friends would say, is actually helpful, but there are still some questions to answer. A part of the difficulty is the brevity, because what that means is that they don't necessarily contain a lot of background details that would answer some questions. or even help us to know who the speaker is, the writer is, and what their background is. Sometimes we have just very, very little information at all, right? Now, we do get some help with this from the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles. Right? They help fill in the gaps in some of these developments. We'll point out a passage of that here in just a few minutes. The same is true with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. As historical books, they fill in the gaps as well, and we still have some spaces where we're just not sure on some questions. Another challenge is drawing in the audience. That is my job. I want to see people come to services to worship and to study, fresh in mind and spirit, ready to worship and lift their thoughts toward heaven. And now as the teacher or preacher, it is my responsibility to make sure that I give them things that are understandable, comprehensible, and have some obvious value. So I've got to make sure that I do a good job in my sermon crafting to hook them and show them that what we're about to look at has value even today. Next. It is imperative to address backgrounds. Now, not to get lost in historical details. That's possible. I love history. And I can spend all my time with that and be just as happy as a clam. But for sermon preaching, preparation, and all that, I need to make sure I have enough to give them the context so that they can carry something away without overloading people with details and boring them potentially in the process at some level. And then the last thing is I want to make sure that I highlight applications. I'll say sometimes to audiences, to my students or whom else we speak, we do talk about history, but it's history with a purpose. It's not just learning the data or the facts like some people, the other side of the world, from whom I'm completely disconnected. These are books that are preserved by the Lord and used by Christians and the people of God through the years, and they have to have some application. And we want to answer the question, why do we need to study this? And if we can do that, then I think that we've given people a reason to tune in and maybe whetted their appetites. It only takes a few times, in my observation, for people to really see the connections and the value, and then they're much more open to the thought there's more treasure to be found in these 12 books. So, all right. Key themes. Here are some ideas that are found consistently in these dozen books. I only offer them as about 6 of them here. By no means do I think that this is comprehensive, and you probably can identify right off the cuff several others that are incredibly important, but these are some that are not negligible, okay? Like, God is the sovereign ruler by right of creation. Many times in the ancient world, they might have looked at a particular group of people and said, oh, they have their deity or deities, and this group of people have theirs, and this group of people have theirs. And oftentimes the sentiment was the dominated people's gods must be inferior, or they wouldn't have been dominated by the other people and their superior gods, right? So the conflict between Pharaoh and the Egyptians versus the Israelites. God explodes that type of myth. The very fact that the minor prophets, along with Isaiah and others too, but in the minor prophets corpus, the fact that there are so many statements that are made holding other nations accountable tells us that God is the ruler of heaven and earth, whether people choose to acknowledge that or not. And it's so because he is the sovereign creator. So he'll speak to Edom, he'll speak to Nineveh and various neighbors seen in both the major and minor prophets. Number 2, they continually address the issue of faithlessness toward Jehovah or Yahweh. There will be a mention of Baal or associated gods. Now you can see that in the non-literary prophets like Elijah, written in the book of 1 Kings, for example. You have Ahab and Jezebel, and they are tied to religions of the Sidonians and those in that region. But faithlessness, there will be this regular appeal. I'm going to borrow the words from Elijah, 1 Kings chapter 18, right? But where he says, how long are you going to limp between two positions or opinions? Look, if God is God, then serve him. If Baal is God, then do that. And of course, the competition that follows demonstrates that God is the one. But they're addressing, and these books do as well, the issue of faithfulness and faithlessness. Number 3, they address the issue of social abuses and disorder. By the way, number 3 follows number 2. The book of Judges says that number 3 follows number 2. If I can borrow this earlier period of Israelite history, the book of Judges, we have the initial part, the prologue, and then we have this series of figures and judges and difficulties, and they spiral, and they'll come back and they'll spiral. And then you get this epilogue, chapter 17 through 21. You look at that and you think, how in the world could these be people who belong to God? And the answer is because they lost number 2. The epilogue seems to have at least one major purpose, is to show this is what people are capable of when God is not appropriately present in their mind and in their thinking. Number next, regional and national consciences, right? So we were chatting. The judges had generally areas or regions where they rose, threw off opposition or things like that, and led the people. So the minor prophets do have areas in particular where they work as a whole. So Jonah goes to Nineveh, Obadiah is going to talk to Edom, others will talk to Judah, Jerusalem. But in the addressing, the full corpus presents to us this entire large picture. I put the word here, conscience. Following the election, I'm not saying anything about it except that. There will be people who write. There will be op-ed pieces in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever digital form of news. And there will be people who speak up and say, what is wrong with us? These are the issues. We should do this. And very often they'll highlight things that are really substantive and accurate, and they serve in some sense as a conscience, at least potentially so. Have you ever considered that the prophets serve as a conscience for the people of God and surrounding peoples whom they address? That's the non-literary prophets as well as the literary prophets. They will often come back and say, what is wrong with us that we would do these things? And so they are appealing to their own people, calling out faithlessness, calling out abuses, and asking people to be better. And that's an important role. I would say that there's also a place for that for preachers, yeah. Encouragement for future work or hope. And I love the fact that this is here, especially concerning the Messiah. But not only that. There will be times where there's statements, for example, to the captives and the exiles, and you will come back and you will settle here, and they end up doing that. One of the reasons why this is such an important category to focus on is that it tells the prophetic power that God possesses, and then number 2, the persistence, the reliability that God demonstrates to make sure he always follows through on what he says he does. And if that includes welcoming people back after waywardness, he will absolutely do that. If it talks about blessings for following him, they are going to take place. It's as if they have already happened in one sense. And a particular way that happens in the minor prophets pertains to Jesus and the Christian faith. We go back to Genesis 12, verse 3. In you will all families of the earth be blessed, God told Abram. And so several passages, as we know, in the minor prophets deal specifically with this issue of the messianic time period and the coming of this Savior, this servant, this figure who will teach and lead, and then the great covenant and so forth that will follow. So there's a real sense of looking forward. I would argue that all of these could be seen as really valuable to a modern audience, and especially this one, because we wouldn't be here without God's faithfulness through the centuries in accomplishing his plans or purposes. All right. Well, I want to change gears just a little bit, and utilizing everything that we've just spoken about, I want to talk for a moment about some things we might bear in mind when we think about preaching the minor prophets. Okay. The first one is how much material there is there to utilize. 67 chapters in these dozen books. And you realize that's one more chapter than the book of Isaiah. In fact, that collection by chapter is longer than any of the major prophets, okay, by chapter count. Now, the verse counts are less, and that's not a problem to acknowledge. But what this tells us is there's a lot of material that is here that needs to be heard by people who are attentive to the Lord. Another reminder. We are talking about people as prophets who are speaking in place of or on behalf of God. I mean, this is what Peter referred to in 2 Peter 1, 20, 21. They were moved or carried by the Holy Spirit. That means the message they gave is divinely authored and it is authoritative. So it is good for us to hear those kinds of things as well. It has been said that the non-literary prophets tend to focus more on contemporary concerns of their time period. And by non-literary, we mean the ones that just didn't write a book. So think Elijah or Elisha as really two prominent examples. So maybe it's not surprising that they really focused more heavily on the things of their own time period because they didn't write it. Right? So they're not preserving a message written for their speaking. If that's true, the literary prophets tend to be identified as a bit more future-focused. Now, that does not have to mean end of time. It does not even have to mean when Jesus arrives, although that is included. But there may be other things like, in the next 70 years, this will take place, or following this time period of punishment, there is a possibility of redemption or mercy and recovery. So they provide some future focus, but I wouldn't want to put this out of balance. It is estimated that of the 67 chapters, the content, 61% of it is predictive. Oftentimes, of course, the reason why these books may be dated late by figures is because the rejection of any kind of predictive prophecy, its accuracy, God's ability, and those complaints are not correct. So, they are predictive, and they do speak about things. Here's what I want to ask you. If there's 61% of the material, there we go. Right button will always help. If there's 61% material that's predictive, what does that leave? You know what? I mean, you're looking at about 40% of this material is not just, hey, what's down the timeline? 40% of this material is, what are we doing, right? Or, that's the way to do it, keep it up, that kind of thing. So there is a balance that addresses contemporary concerns, and that's a lot. And if it has to do with the business of life, faithfulness, fidelity to the Lord, that's an important component as well. So I would, if I were me, I would say, I want to make sure that I do a good job of having a good mix here and recognizing that there's a lot of great material to proclaim. Some of it looking forward, maybe to time periods in which I now live, but also things that were important then for the business of life that are also important today for us as a business of life. Now, one thing that I would say, aren't you glad that you do not have to live out some of these messages like Hosea had to with Gomer? Aren't you glad we don't have to do an action lesson like some of them did? That's not to say that we can't use some props or things to point to. I mean, that's what a PowerPoint is even, right? But thankfully, we are spared some of the other things that earlier prophets, were asked to do as a part of living out and preaching their message. Okay. All right, so what can we do? Let's talk about topical lessons that you and I could preach that are tied to key verses. And maybe this is how some persons hear the minor prophets frequently. I don't know that, but it's possible. So let's just say tied to key verses. Again, this is suggestive. It is not at all comprehensive, right? It might be that we do something like Joel. And this is not even the part of Joel that connects to Acts chapter 2, explicitly quoted by Peter, right? Even now, return to me with all of your heart, fasting, weeping, mourning, rend your hearts and not your garments. That's a very famous verse. And it could be heard by people today who need to make those kinds of decisions. Or maybe Amos 5, the roaring prophet, seek good and not evil that you may live. And look, we get to be with the Lord. I'm reminded from this verse of John chapter 8 and verse 29. Jesus says, he who sent me is with me. He's not left me alone. And then he says, why? Because I do always those things that please him. Sure sounds a lot like Amos 5:14 in theme, right? Micah 6:8. Now, this one we're going to talk about in some detail here in just a couple of moments, okay? But Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Great. That might even be one that we could do as a textual sermon. We'll mention in a second. Maybe you've heard this one, maybe one of the more famous that is tied to the book of Hosea. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Nahum 1:7. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows how to take care of people who are casting their confidence in him, take refuge. What a great idea to utilize when people are facing challenges or struggles or feeling like there's no one there to help or support. And the answer from Nahum could be, there is. And it's the best being of all. Habakkuk 2:4. Find this in Romans 1, right? Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. Now, those are the arrogant, the unrighteous. But the righteous is going to live by his faith, by his knowledge and confidence in the Lord. Paul uses this by inspiration, by the way. One more. One longer one here. Zechariah 1:3. Therefore say to them, thus declares the Lord of hosts, return to me, and I will return to you. Sounds a lot to me like James chapter 4, like verse 10, right? You'll draw close to him or near to him, and he'll draw to you. So a lot of very similar themes. And then finally, Malachi's challenging the people of his time. They were not steeped in idolatry, but they did substitute and dismiss and give the Lord leftovers rather than the best. And so here's a statement. Will a man rob God? It is meant to be a thought-provoking, rhetorical statement that generates proper reflection. And these are just some potential topicals based on key verses, and these, you may have an even better list of key verses than the ones I've offered, but if so, those could become the starting points for some lessons. Another way to do topical studies might be by doing character studies. Okay, so all of a sudden, we want to talk about, we want to be able to talk about Hosea and Gomer. As one writer said, it's interesting to think about why in the world would God have a man marry someone who is going to be unfaithful? But it's even more significant for people to stop and realize that God himself was married to a people who became unfaithful. If it was off-putting for the thought of this husband and wife, how much more inappropriate and offensive to think about God and the nation that he's delivered, that he's brought out, the people that he's brought out. So that may be a study. Of course, we've had a great lesson on Jonah, and there may be others as character studies. Could do textual, and what we mean from that is content that is suggested by the text, but not necessarily expanded. It may give us the items. Let's talk about this, this, and this, and then we may build that from wherever we go in the Bible, but there are some passages that are suggestive that we could point to. And then finally, the last one, and this is where I'd like to spend the rest of our time this afternoon, is to talk about some expository lessons. That is, where the content of the message itself is contained in the text. And it's really just a matter of exposing it for what it is and helping the audience to see it and then to abstract from it or take from it these timeless lessons that would be just as applicable today as at any other point in history. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to use the next several minutes that we have in this last section, and I would like to sketch out for you some different expository lesson outlines. Okay? Now these are just ones that I've found or identified. They're just some. They are illustrative. They are not at all definitive about what one could do. But I will ask also, if you have your Bible, we'll take a moment and turn. I just want to point out a thing or two that connects with what I'm going to show on the screen. I've also tried, I've got 6 of these, and so I've tried with these 6 to identify different time periods and different types of themes so that we get a good variety in multiple ways. And the first one here is Sowing the Wind from the book of Obadiah. If you would like to look there, we'll just note a couple of things quickly and easily, I hope. First of all, the backdrop. Now, this is another one of those areas where dating questions surface, but I'm going to take this as the sack of Jerusalem in the year 845 by Philistines and those who neighbor the country or region of Ethiopia. And what happens is that Edom, the descendants of Esau, they lived there in Edom, just to the east and south side of the Dead Sea. They are rejoicing at what is taking place in Jerusalem. In fact, there's a lovely German word that captures this idea fabulously. Okay? I don't know that Obadiah knew that word, okay, but which one was it? There it is, right there in black and in blue and white. Schadenfreude. You're like, what? Can you say that? Yes. Schadenfreude, all it means is joy in someone else's misery, suffering, or problems. And that captures the book of Obadiah in a moment, right? So here is how one could look at the book of Obadiah, laying out just one chapter, 21 verses. If you were to look in chapter 1, there's only one. The vision of Obadiah, it says, thus says the Lord of God concerning Edom. Those are the descendants of Esau. They're cousins, right? So they ought to be on the same page as Judah, the descendants of Jacob, and they are not. The text says, we have heard a report from the Lord, an envoy has been sent among the nations. Say, arise, let us go against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. This is God speaking to Edom. And one could imagine receiving this letter and thinking, what did I do? Okay. By the way, as a bonus observation, in verse 2, your Bible may have it in the future tense. I will make you small among the nations. Right? So I'm going to bring you down. In Hebrew, it's not actually a future. It is a perfect tense. It's used to speak about things that are done. This is proleptic. It is a fait accompli. It just simply means that this is talked about as though it's a done deal. You cannot stop what I'm about to do in terms of retribution. Well, if you were to look down in verses 3 through 9, he'll identify pride. Problem number 1 is pride. They are so arrogant and filled with hubris that they essentially think that they can ignore everyone, including God. And he reminds them that that is incorrect. In verses 10 through 14, closing out that first section, is the second problem. They actually took part in the violence against Judah and Jerusalem. A couple of different things that happened. They seem to have circled off or bounded their own region or territory, and any refugees or fugitives from Judah and Jerusalem in this sacking of the city, they were not allowed to come in for safety. They closed them off. You're not welcome here. They essentially left them out to depredations. And the second thing that is a part of this violence that they did was that they took part in the plunder. And so they seem to have gone in and sacked the place somewhat themselves. By the way, I always want to be fair in dealing with people and history and nations, blah, blah. They locked out and said, you can't flee for safety here. Stay out there and experience it. It's interesting to read about Switzerland during World War II, the preceding years, and during World War II, when they closed their borders and even sent out Jewish people in their territory, their country. They would not let Jews flee into Switzerland, though they were alleged to be neutral. And as a result, became in some way complicit in what they experienced. So this is not so far removed from the way people behave. This is an issue, right? I'm not saying Switzerland engaged in Schadenfreude, Chuck, but I will say that not being a place of refuge for people who are fleeing for their lives, that's an issue. That's an issue. That's them, yeah. So in verses 15 and 16, a general proclamation about the nations. Remember, God is sovereign by right of creation. And he says he'll hold any nation accountable. And then finally, in the last portion, he speaks in a promising fashion back to Judah that they would do well in the end, that this is not the end of their story. It's interesting that this chapter closes with the words of Psalm 22, verse number 8. Words that are meant to encourage, right? Deliverers will ascend Mount Zion. To judge the mountain of Esau, the kingdom will be the Lord's. Anybody, I'm sure you recognize Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? This psalm that is very messianic provides the final verse for the inspired book of Obadiah and deliverance. We could also tack onto this 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 6 through 10, that talks about a great reversal. Those who have persecuted Christians will find themselves persecuted when the Lord comes back. And those who've been persecuted, the Christians, will find rest. So that's what this book involves, is a great reversal between the antagonists of God's people and the fortunes of God's people. That is the book of Obadiah, sowing the wind, God's ultimate rule and reign. Next, I love this one. This is one of my favorites to look at. It's from the book of Micah, chapter 6. If you'd like to just turn there. It's an easy and quick read, I think. But Micah chapter 6. We find Micah writing in the 8th century, a time of great prosperity in Judah. The problem is it's only material or secular or physical prosperity. Spiritually and socially, they are very much on the rocks. And so chapter number 6, verses 1 through 8 is the setting, or is the material, and it could be broken down this way. In the first 2 verses, hear now what the Lord is saying, arise and plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Listen, mountains, to the indictment of the Lord, you enduring foundations of the earth, because the Lord has a case against his people. Even with Israel he will dispute. Does it look or sound like there is courtroom language in this section? Now, if it strikes you that it sounds like that, that's only because it is there. And that's the way God wanted it to be. He's got the physical earth that knows the power of God, recognizes his sovereignty, that is serving as the jury. You've got the summons, like the bailiff is standing up and saying, come and plead your case. Here is the Lord, the defendant. Here is Judah, Jerusalem, the plaintiff. And so you can see each of them highlighted in this discussion. Notice 3 through 5. My people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me. So who's talking here? That's the Lord. And he wants to know, what have I done that's wrong? I brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I ransomed you. I sent these leaders. Remember what I did with Balak and Balaam. Why? So that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. Remember, so the review of history to demonstrate God's goodness. But then you notice in verses 6 and 7, the plaintiff's trial, the plaintiff's case. With what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oils? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? What do you notice about the tone of verses 6 and 7? This may be clear to all of you, and that's fantastic, but do you notice how it escalates? You want sacrifices? Let me guess, you're not going to be happy with that. You're going to want thousands. Let me guess, if you want thousands, God, you're the kind of being, if we give an inch, you'll take a mile. And it closes at the end of verse number 7 by saying, come on, do you want me to slay my children and give them to you? Back off, right? Stop being so demanding. Which is where the trial's conclusion comes in verse number 8, the very famous passage. He's told you, O man, what is good, what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. God is not bloodthirsty. He is not out of bounds on his requests or demands. In fact, everything he asks is good. He is wrongly vilified right here. He's vilified just like he was in the Garden of Eden. Have you ever had a conversation with anybody that says, I might think about Christianity or church later on in life. I got things I want to do right now. I had one fellow tell me, I want to have fun for a while. As if all of a sudden God is this cosmic killjoy who's going to steal every bit of fun and enjoyment and blessings that a human being could experience. That's this kind of viewpoint. Looking back very quickly, notice in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, if you would. Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil in their beds. When morning comes, they do it. It is in the power of their hands. They covet fields, they seize them, houses, and they take them away. They rob a man in his house, a man and his inheritance. You might go to chapter 3, verse 1. I said, hear now, heads of Jacob, rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? File that away. We go back just a smidge, chapter 2. Notice with me, if you will, verses 8 and 9. Recently, my people have arisen as an enemy. You strip the robe of off the garment from an unsuspecting passerby, from those returned from war. The women of my people, potentially widows, the women of my people you evict, each one from her pleasant house. From her children, could be orphans as well, from her children you take my splendor forever. And then one more spot, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills. The people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go out the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." I wonder why in chapter 6, verse 8, he mentions those three things: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with the Lord. Why those three? I mean, maybe you and I would concoct a different list or a larger list. Why those three? Because that's exactly what the people in the days of Micah were wrestling with. And he catalogs their abuses. So when he gives this outcome, all he's doing is saying, here is what you're doing. God just wants you to fix it. I mean, you do wear his name, right? So the very last part of that trial and the verdict, we would say, matches the context of what they've been experiencing. God has been vilified. The judgment is for Judah to return to faithfulness and to live ethically. Remember our comments about social abuse and violence. Okay. Number next. Let's talk about Zephaniah. We'll do these quickly. I know we're arriving at time. But through judgment to blessings. And so here we are. And you can see there the day of the Lord, which was mentioned in the earlier lessons, a common phrasing in the minor prophets. But Zephaniah, these are in the days of Josiah, perhaps writing about the year 609 BC. And this means we're in the Judah alone period. So the third of our four from before. And they could have learned lessons by watching what happened to the people of Israel, but they did not. And so instead, God has this. Look within, he says. This is to talk about the first one, wrath that is to come. But it's coming on the people of God, Judah and Jerusalem. And there's an appeal there to repent. There's another reminder as well. They could look around. Historically, God has held the people of other nations accountable. They've experienced the Lord's punishment or his wrath. He even lists places like Gath, the Philistines, Moab, Ammon, and others. And the point that is being made is that Jerusalem, Judah, should have looked around and seen other people misbehave, they get into trouble. I'm going to do things the right way. And the lament is, you're not. So they have problems inside. They could see how others behaved, and they didn't get off any better. But that last section, look beyond, has to do with looking beyond to the fact that those who do change or turn, there are better days on the horizon. As a parent, correcting his children and wanting the best, but they have a voice, they have a part to play. So the faithful are told in this last section to wait for God, right? And for those who are willing to make the changes in their life, there's a lot of joy to be found. I'm fairly convinced that this could have a current application. How about one from Habakkuk? I don't know how often we hear Habakkuk sermons, but here's one. From a sob to a song. That's been a title that's been used in various times. So this is about the same time period, just prior to Babylonian conquest, and the leaders and people are behaving badly. What's different about this one is this is where the people, that is Habakkuk, take the people's complaint to the Lord. Usually it's the other direction. Here's the Lord, like what we just saw, previous section. The Lord is speaking to the people, here's my complaint. Habakkuk takes it and goes the opposite direction. And what he's essentially doing is lamenting, is providing the voice of lament of the righteous, asking God, how long are you going to let them do this? The righteous asking, how long are the wicked going to be allowed to keep doing bad stuff? God, please, in motion, please answer them. All right, so burden, faith's burden. You can see this right at the beginning of chapter number 1. And he asks those questions. How long are you going to let them get away with this? And then, more than that, he's going to use Babylon to correct, right, the nation. Faith's vision, then, there is clarity that is being given. Babylon is going to be a tool in God's hands. And people might look and say, but they're just as bad. Have you ever noticed in the stories in the book of Daniel, we see Nebuchadnezzar profiled, at least in the front part of the book, right? Nebuchadnezzar is puzzling to me. He would always say things like, your God is the true God. And then he'd turn around another episode, your God is the true God. I'm like, I thought you said that before, right? Difficulty sinking in. The reality is that Nebuchadnezzar was in love with power. He was impressed with power. He wasn't impressed with God. So he needed occasional opportunities where he saw power flexed once again, but he never made a commitment to actually following the one who demonstrated that authority and power, and that's where he went wrong. So faith's vision is going to see Babylon is also going to answer for their deeds. And then finally, faith's assurance. At the end, God speaks and says, just patience, and they will get an answer. We could say the righteous are ultimately going to be vindicated, but here's the reason why. Evil is destructive. It never builds anything good or lasting. And evil has its own victims. Sadly, the figures they're lamenting, right, are going to be those victims. But what he points out is that evil is going to destroy itself. They will have a comeuppance. And so they will be vindicated. In the meanwhile, there's Paul's quote, we're just going to keep living the right path. Maybe this is something that could be heard in 21st century America. We may be called a Christian nation, but that is an outdated designation if it were ever correct in the first place. The Lord's people, especially for those who would say, I want to follow the Bible, take this seriously, high view of Scripture, we are in the minority, sadly, and also often vilified or challenged, etc. Maybe I need to remember that in the end, evil destroys itself, and right is always right. So let's do right. Next. The book of Haggai, looking after the affairs of God. If you have your Bible, I really want to take a minute and look at this one. Actually, these next two are from the book of Haggai, and these will be our last two. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. I love songs because I never remember without a song. So, and even with them, sometimes I'm a bit challenged. So, yeah, a lot challenged. Okay, here we go. In the book of Haggai. You may know these terms. Somebody's designated as a designated hitter, right? Or someone who's a right-hand man. What do you call the position played in baseball by someone who you can put them in a number of different places and count on them to do well? That is a utility player, right? Those are valuable people. They may not get the headlines like Ellie De La Cruz or other people like that, but they're very important players because they fill what needs to be filled. They have the team in mind and they do what the team needs to have done. Well, the background for the book of Haggai is this reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They came out of captivity in 538. Cyrus allows them to. They make their way back, those who wish to do so, back to the city of Jerusalem. And by about 537, 536, they are able to start the process of building the temple, laying the foundations, restoring it. It had been razed in 586. There were a number of people who really challenged them and tried to present some opposition, and that may cool off the ardor just a little bit. But they really ended up forgetting that they needed to do the business of the Lord. So here is the way chapter number 1 lays out. You have the reason of neglect in the first 4 verses. You have the consequence or result of it. And then you have the recognition of neglect in the last part. And I want to flip there, and my pages here in my Bible are very small and thin, but I want us to notice a few of these pieces together if we can. Okay. They really are thin. And I am fumble-fingered. What do you notice about verse number 4 of chapter 1? And then verse 5. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies desolate? Now, therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. That consider your ways is really the money line, if you will, from this section. So what's happened is, if you read that first part, they've come back and they've started, but then they got off track and years passed, and they never get it built. In the meanwhile, they've made sure they have central heat and air, they have good finished paneling inside, the LED TVs on the wall, the sound system is put up. Everything that they live in is really, really good. And the writer then speaks in that second section, the result of neglect, the famous lines about earning wages, putting them into a pocket or a bag that's got holes in it. In other words, they never get ahead because they're prioritizing themselves, not the Lord, who's the source of their blessing. And then finally, in verses 12 through 15, all of a sudden they hear this, and in verse 12 it says, they obeyed the voice of the Lord and the words of Haggai, and they got up and they began to build. Now they still had a bit to do. It was completed in 516, 70 years after it was destroyed. But the whole section here is applicable in a discussion, am I going to look after God's business, or am I just doing self? And I would like to suggest that you could link this to the book of Philippians, for example, chapter 2. In verses 19 through 24, Paul highlights Timothy. He says, I have no one who like-minded who will look after the affairs of God and not his own things. So Timothy is very selfless. I would expand it even farther for your consideration and say, every example from Jesus to Paul to Timothy and Epaphroditus, he tells data in chapter 2, information about comings and goings and doings. But it's all a description couched in the form of service to others. And that really captures the whole idea behind this lesson. And then the last one, and we will be done. Eyes filled with hope. This is right in the next chapter. This second chapter, and really there are multiple visions in the second chapter, but we're concerned about the first one in the chapter. If you were to go back and look at Ezra chapter 3, verses 11 through 13, you can imagine as they're building, and you've got the floor plan out here for the temple, and everyone starts building the walls, and they can see, what materials do we have? Where do we have to put some limits? I don't have that, but I do have this. We can do this. There were a few of them, as Ezra mentions, a few of them that were old enough that they can remember from their childhood what the Temple of Solomon looked like before it was destroyed in 586. And they started crying. In fact, in that passage, there's a mixture of joy tears and sadness, sorrow tears. And the text says it's hard to tell whenever you saw somebody weeping. Were they doing it for joy? Hey, we're making progress. Or were they doing it out of sorrow and sadness because they know that this does not measure up to what they saw when they were a child. And so in some ways, this is an issue of regret over the past. There are times people have wrestle with that, regret over the past. And what could have been if we had just stayed the course and been faithful. But here's how God is binding up through Haggai. And I love that he does this. Here we go. The reason for discouragement in verses 1 through 3. And if you were to look at that, you'll see what he asks in verse 3. Who is left among you who saw the temple in its former glory? How do you see it now? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? So God is hitting the issue head on. I know that some of you are looking at this and you're thinking it's not going to measure up at all. The good thing is that in verses 4 and 5, he's going to pick up their chins and help them out. And so in verse 4, he speaks to them and he says, now take courage. Those are positive words. Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Take courage also Joshua, the civil ruler and the spiritual leader, right? High priest. The high priest, all the people of the land take courage, declares the Lord, and work. Why? Because I'm with you, declares the Lord of hosts. As for the promise which I made you when you came out of Egypt, my spirit is abiding in you. In your midst, do not fear. And so, discouragement, he answers it and says, I'm here. All is well. And then finally, the last part, reason for celebration. I'll leave it to you to read that. But what it looks like he's saying, I think this is right, is you may not see it now, but there are extraordinary things that are going to be affiliated with this temple, the second temple, as we call it. It is going to be expanded by Herod. It is going to be an amazing place. But even more significantly, that's where Jesus is going to teach. More significantly, that's where Jesus is going to worship. Right? That's where he's going to have opportunities, and in the city of Jerusalem, to fulfill his mission for which he came. And so this last section is, great plans are underway. We ought to celebrate. We don't have long vision. God has long vision. What we want to do is make sure that we try and lean on him even when we have an end to what we can see in front of us. He doesn't. So if he says great things are to come, my job is just to trust him and to celebrate because he knows what he's talking about. By the way, as a final description, this is in the Talmud Bava Basra section, simple description. Whoever has not seen Herod's temple has not seen a beautiful building in all his life. I realize Herod, starting about 20 BC probably, began to build, and that's what monarchs did, and beautify and things like that. And then Jesus comes. And those figures earlier on in verses 4 through 9, they didn't know, but God did. And so this is his way of encouraging them. This is not less. It's going to be even better. And so he's got optimism and he's got hope here for his people. Just a smattering, and we're going to stop there, but just an idea of some things that might be done preaching through some sections of the Minor Prophets. And it seems to me that it's not too much to say that there are lessons that are valuable for modern audiences who want spiritual sensibilities and to serve the same God that they were worshiping and serving as well. And that is it. So, timing, 2:11, 2:12. I know we've got a break coming, and I see Matt in the back. He's at 2:30, is that right? And so, but I don't know if you wanted to comments or anything like that that you might add. Tell me something that I missed that I need to add, because I got preach coming up too, and I need an outline. So.
Years ago, Brother Philip Slade spoke
Yeah.
to the sermon. He called the prophets the covenant enforcers. And I think
Great.
that speaks to the conscience.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I've wondered why, and people have wondered. It's nothing new with me. When Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration, it is Moses and Elijah, not Moses and Isaiah, for example. And I wonder if the reason why it might have been Elijah is because here is a person who was indefatigable in trying to be a conscience for the people and challenge them to come back to faithfulness. I think that conscience issue. Socrates ended up taking his life, forced to do so for being a gadfly, which is just somebody that was, to those who didn't want to hear, an annoyance, but what he had to say needed to be heard, right? This even more so. Thank you very much. I'll make sure I mention that as well, or jot it down.
Well, that's probably going to step on what Matt's going to do next, but
Excellent.
as a prophet,
Sorry, bro.
the prophets, standing up and being that voice that you troubler of Israel, it was,
Yep.
it's tough.
Yeah, hard. And I know we just have this body of material, right? But then you stop and you think about the things that Jeremiah experienced. And they're all, from the same cloth in a way. I mean, even though they didn't have necessarily the same difficult circumstances. But then I wonder too, hey, does everybody like Rick? Do I care or do I just need to say with truth and love the things God once said, because people need to hear it, regardless of what they think about Rick. I don't have to be off-putting, but I need to be honest and preach the whole counsel of God. Would I fit in their company? That's a great question. For me, personally. Other things?
I would recommend preaching on it, like scheduling it, because, you could do 12 sermons, 12 prophets.
Yeah, you could, sure.
Or you do, what would we say, 63 chapters?
Yeah.
What would you recommend?
Well, that 60-some-odd chapters, that's going to get you through next year. So, actually, it's a very interesting question, and there are any number of ways that you would want to set it up. All I would say, and I'm saying this to Rick, who can start things, and I need to see them through to the end, is whatever structure you want to use, just make sure that you got it laid out and planned out, and you follow it through. And I don't want to have a dry fire after I get started. But you could organize it by time period. Okay, we're going to talk about general circumstances, and even if you don't do all the prophets, we had them 3, 3, 3, 3. You could do some, good selections of them to give an idea. It also helps not just with the sense of personal application and value, but it fills in knowledge base and so forth. You could do it perhaps like that and walk through time periods. That might be a way to do it. This is just something Rick did. It's not a good idea. It's not a bad idea. I just did it. But I did do, to answer that question, I did do an overview of every book of the Bible in 2 pages. Okay? And so it works fine for Obadiah. It's really challenging for Psalms. But that was every Sunday night for 66 weeks, plus holidays and gospel meetings, right? Every Sunday night. And I had a handout. Want to get some of that material went into doing this because I didn't want to repeat the work again a second time. But every person in the congregation walked away with 132 pages of summary type material, right? And so I just had a plan. I worked, stayed ahead of the curve, and tried to get it. You could do the same kind of thing, certainly, through any of this prophetic literature. And it would be very, very valuable. So when you do that, please email me a copy. So, anything else? Yeah, Jacob.
And I mean, you had a little sort of blurb about this.
Sure.
A lot of sermons you'll see coming out of the prophets are directed towards America. You know, like where they take it and they go, okay, here's God bombasting a nation, therefore America's the correlation. But wouldn't it be more accurate to say that, because most of these are focusing on God's covenant people, wouldn't the correlation be more suited for the church?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the way that it goes, I think that's a very good sensitivity to have. I mean, the bulk of these, but not all of them, right? Nineveh, Edom, Philistia, and others are to the outside. But maybe that's also a point that really highlights there's an applicability to this body of literature that deserves to be recognized. It needs to be respected contextually. I don't want to make a prophet say something that God didn't want him to say. I don't have the right to do that. But handling the material in a responsible fashion, there are great messages about fidelity, about the treatment of other people, about just because I live under a different covenant doesn't mean the basic ideas that characterize our God and should characterize his people are absent. And we live in the middle of a secular world, and secularism can creep in and things like that. I think that's a very accurate assessment. Anything else? Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time.